There's this debate bro obsession in some communities with addressing hypocrisy over the actual underlying worth of what's happening. Because from a consequentialist perspective, Hassan's not really doing any harm in the world, but there are some people who are more obsessed with the idea of holding people to account, you know? Like, I'll give you an example. A community of people who think that it's more acceptable for a person to eat meat if they don't believe animals have any moral worth than it is for a vegetarian to only eat eggs, cheese, and dairy if they do believe animals have any moral worth. In that case, you actually value people's consistency above the actual harm they do, which is an insane perspective.
Hey, what is up, guys? So Vaush, who is a primarily left-wing political streamer on Twitch and on YouTube, recently took like a vague shot toward a specific subset of vegans within the vegan community. And this is a specific subset of vegans that I don't think he's fully understanding. This all happened in one of his latest streams covering the recent backlash that Hassanabi has been receiving for purchasing a $2.7 million home in Beverly Hills, California, while being a very strong advocate for socialist ideals and not instead spending his influx of money more responsibly. Long story short, a lot of the pro-socialism community are claiming that Hassan is a moral hypocrite for making this purchase of a $2.7 million home in Beverly Hills. Now, I'm not going to be going into my actual thoughts on whether I think Hassan is a moral hypocrite for purchasing the house, because that's really not the point of this video. This video is concerning Vaush and a slight shot taken at a subset of vegans in his addressing of the Hassan issue. I want to start with explaining the beginning of the clip you just watched. In the clip, Vaush was trying to point out that the behavior of some of these people who are criticizing Hassan is reflective of a kind of debate bro mentality where if a person possesses it, they will tend to care more for exposing hypocrisy within a person rather than the actual immorality of their behaviors. He illustrates this with an example where a hypothetical person who possesses this debate bro mentality has a problem with an animal-loving vegetarian harming animals as a result of purchasing cheese and eggs more than they would have a problem with a meat eater who doesn't care about animals, who is harming even more animals than the vegetarian as a result of their meat eating. Basically, the idea here is that these kinds of debate bro people are more preoccupied with pointing out hypocrisy and moral inconsistency in people rather than pointing out the actual negative consequences of a person's actions. And the reason they are preoccupied with pointing out hypocrisy is because to these people, being morally consistent is more acceptable than actual consequences.
Like, I'll give you an example. A community of people who think that it's more acceptable for a person to eat meat if they don't believe animals have any moral worth than it is for a vegetarian to only eat eggs, cheese, and dairy if they do believe animals have any moral worth. In that case, you actually value people's consistency above the actual harm they do.
So this kind of debate bro, which Vaush is referring to, would think that a meat eater who is harming animals from their meat eating, who doesn't care about animals, is acting in a more morally acceptable manner than a vegetarian who proclaims to care about animals but is harming animals as a result of consuming cheese and eggs. In other words, a person being morally consistent, even if it causes more harm, is more acceptable than a person behaving in a morally inconsistent manner who is causing less harm. So although Vaush doesn't explicitly say that the kind of debate bro he is talking about is one which he has seen in the vegan community, it seems pretty clear to me that he at the very least thinks that they do exist in the vegan community, especially when you take into account the example he gave, his past issues with vegans, and how before he gave this example he said, there is this debate bro obsession in some communities.
There's this debate bro obsession in some communities.
So I just want to challenge the idea that these vegan quote-unquote debate bro types who value a person being consistent over the consequences of a person's actions even exist, or at the very least exist to any meaningful degree. Particularly because I know the kind of vegan Vaush is trying to describe, and I think he is misinterpreting their style of discussing veganism as a sign that they care more for a person's consistency than the negative consequences they generate. And one of the reasons I'm familiar with the kind of vegan Vaush is trying to describe is because I believe I'm actually one of them. Myself and many vegans like to tackle veganism from an angle of seeing if a person is being morally inconsistent or if a person's morals dictate they should be vegan. There are a multitude of reasons why vegans decide to do this. I do it because, in my experience, the logical structure of a lot of people's morals actually dictate that they should be vegan. Many people have views that say it is wrong to exploit and murder cats and dogs for consumption, so what I'll do is I'll use these views as a starting point in my discussion with them on veganism and see if they can establish a morally relevant difference between, say, dogs and cows, such that it is ethical to kill cows for hamburgers, but not dogs. A lot of the time, the person will end up discovering that they cannot establish a morally relevant difference between dogs and cows, such that it is ethical to slaughter one for food and not the other. Which leads them to the conclusion that according to their own moral system, they ought to be vegan, and that if they continue to not be vegan, they are acting as a moral hypocrite. Checking to see if a person is morally consistent or acting hypocritically is just, in my experience, a very quick and effective way to show a person who doesn't possess psychopathic morals that they should be vegan. Now, just because my style of debate and many vegans' style of debate in discussing veganism involves holding people accountable to their own moral standards does not mean that we think a person being logically consistent in their ethics is more valuable than the consequences of their actions. And the reason for this is because somebody can have completely psychopathic but logically consistent morals. For example, a meat eater can say that taste pleasure justifies gassing pigs to death, and I can ask them, so what if I, had a human and gassed them to death because they tasted good, and they end up saying, yeah, sure, that's totally fine. If they say, yeah, that's totally fine, technically they're being consistent, but that doesn't mean I think they are more morally acceptable than a person who is being morally inconsistent but is generating much less suffering. I also want to mention that when I and other vegans use this kind of, consistency-based dialogue when talking to people about veganism, it's not like when we encounter a person who lays out a completely psychopathic but consistent position, we just stop and give up in trying to persuade the person and say, oh, well, I guess you're being consistent, your behavior is totally acceptable. Of course, we don't do that. At this point, a lot of the time, I will try to, maybe convince them to reevaluate the structure of their morals and what they deem as acceptable. Here is a very common example of this that I used to do all the time during my outreach at university. Sometimes people would bite the bullet on farming dogs and tell me that they have absolutely no problem with dogs being killed for food, in the same way that cows are being killed for food. So at this point, I wouldn't just be like, oh dude, you're being consistent, I guess, end of conversation. No, I would point out a dog that would pass by us and say, so if I just went up to that dog and just started torturing them and stabbing them to death in order to eat them, just like we currently do to livestock animals, you would be totally okay with that. And then sometimes the person would actually think about it and realize, hey, maybe I would care. And then boom, they would consider refining their ethical system. So in summary, approaching veganism and vegan debates from a perspective of consistency and, seeing if someone's morals are logically consistent does not necessarily mean that you value a person being consistent over the actual consequences of their actions. And the kind of vegan debate bro that Vaush insinuated exists within the vegan community who values consistency over consequences, in my view, generally speaking, does not exist. So this video was originally dedicated to Vaush's little insinuation, but I think it does apply to a common critique I've seen of people who use the name the trade argument in their vegan advocacy, or the vegans who like to debate or establish that people's views are contradictory, who are often characterized as people who are just debate bros and don't really care about the actual causes they're fighting for, etc. So I hope I made a decent case defending these kinds of vegans. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who is your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid